Hey guys, good morning. Sorry to surprise you by not being there. Um, I didn't want us to get behind, so even though I'm not there today, I wanted to present this to you in the only way that I can. So pay attention. We'll also still be doing notes like usual. So as things are underlined on the screen, just keep writing them down. I'll try and go slow enough that I hope everybody gets time to write the stuff down, but you may have to go a little faster than usual today, just because I can't see who still has writing to do or whatnot. So hopefully this works okay. All right, so we're starting in this new slideshow. This is 5.4, as you can see here, Punishment and Revolution. If you remember last time we talked, we started getting to where Boston was rebelling, where Boston had violence that was happening. Other places did too, but especially Boston. And the British started to punish Boston by closing their port, but that wasn't going to be the end of the punishments that would come for them. So we'll kind of move into some of these new punishments that they think of right now. The first one, really the first acts that started getting passed, the British have all their own names for them, but the Americans start calling them the Intolerable Acts. The British didn't call them that, of course, because that means unbearable or terrible. They wouldn't want to name it that right out the gate, because then they'd already make Americans mad. That would be silly, right? So the British end up making these laws, though, that the Americans hate, and they call intolerable. But this is because the British are super mad at the colonists, especially Boston. And so they passed two sets of acts. One's called the Coercive Acts, and the other is the Quebec Act, which basically target Massachusetts. Some of the other colonies do also face some punishment from this, but it's mostly Massachusetts. And like I said, the colonists, they said these were intolerable acts, because intolerable means something you can't handle or something you can't bear. Can't tolerate, if that makes sense. Sorry, I'll just give you another minute here. Hopefully you can't hear my cat. He's being loud right now. Silly cat. All right, on to the next one. So the coercive acts were just part of this, right? They're aimed at Massachusetts especially. And the three big things they do is make that closure of Boston Harbor a legal act. Basically, they say, we'll open your harbor back up when you pay for that tea you dumped in to the sea. So, which was quite a bit of money. I read the estimate was about $1 million of money in today's money. So not easy to come up with that chunk of change right away. It also limited the amount of control that the Massachusetts legislature had. It used to be that the king would basically let them make their own laws, unless the governor said, hey, I don't know about this law, and he would write to the king or to Parliament and say, hey, should I make them get rid of this law type thing. It didn't happen too often. So usually the Massachusetts legislature had kind of control over a lot of their own local laws. But the coercive acts take that out of the picture. No longer can Massachusetts make their own laws. They will have to follow whatever the British governors say or whatever Parliament says only. And the British Army now could actually force colonists to rent them rooms in their homes. Before this, it was like seen as kind of a civil service, right? You would let a British soldier stay in your house, and you would feed him and feed him and take care of, boarding for him. So a lot of times that would include like doing the laundry for him and things like that. And the British government would pay you a little bit of money to make up for that inconvenience and for that cost. And that was seen as a civil service by some people, but so many people in Boston would refuse to do this that the British actually made a law saying, we can force you to do this. If you have extra rooms and we know about it, then we will come in and say, we're letting this soldier sleep here. Which you could see would be kind of an annoying thing, especially if you are someone who's not very happy with the British right now. Could create some big problems for you. And the next one is the Quebec Act. This was basically similar to the Proclamation of 1763, except for that it not only said that the colonists weren't allowed to go to the Ohio River Valley, but if they did eventually go to the Ohio River Valley, maybe if there's a new treaty made with the natives, it was going to add the Ohio River Valley to the Quebec territory, which is Canada. Basically, it says that the American colonists will not have any say in this land, even if the British change their mind later, which is another thing that ticks off a lot of people, especially those that had fought in the war against the French. So as you can imagine, people are pretty upset by these, which is why they called them the Intolerable Acts. You don't usually name something that strong of a word if you're okay with it, right? It'd be like the minorly annoying acts or the frustration acts or something simple like that, but intolerable, can't even bear it. They obviously don't like it very much. So a lot of the radical leaders in Boston, especially, but in other places as well, they really wanted to fight against these acts. These are horrible, terrible things from their perspective. And so what they have to organize at this point is some sort of way to keep Boston from giving in. If Boston gives in, then it's going to be kind of a signal to the rest of the colonies that there's no use fighting back against the British. They're just going to win no matter what we try. And so they convinced other colonies to send as much food and clothing and things like that that the Bostonians would end up needing to the colony so that they could help to keep that the fight going, basically, by not surrendering, not giving in to these demands from the British. And so the colonists start kind of working together at this point and thinking of themselves as a group kind of against the British. At this point, we'd been basically British. The American colonists consider themselves British in most every way. But now we start to see kind of a division, a rift happening between Americans and the British. They now have kind of a common enemy to unite and work against, if that makes sense. All right, so another act was passed. This one's called the New England Restraining Act. This one is targeting New England especially. Remember, Massachusetts is a part of New England, but this would also include things like, oh my gosh, my brain is dying, I'm sorry, Rhode Island, Connecticut, some of those others that also had some resistance happening there too. So now they started to enforce the ban on trading with other countries a lot more. Before, it was kind of a law, it was important, but not very many people really got caught doing it. And if you did get caught, it was kind of like a, hey, you shouldn't be doing that kind of thing, not really a huge punishment. But they started to enforce that a lot heavier, and they started to take away the fisheries of the colonies. So they basically said, okay, no longer can citizens of this colony fish in these waters. Now we're only letting the Canadians fish there. Things like that, where they started to take away some of the things that people had come to rely on for their livelihood, which of course makes a lot of people mad. This is one of the publications from King George about some of these acts. He wrote lots of things that were just like edicts to the people, like basically saying this is what I'm doing and why type thing. So the Americans start to really get organized in this fight against what they view as tyranny. So in September of 1774, representatives from all the colonies got together and they formed what we call the First Continental Congress. The word Congress, we think of it now as meaning that like a part of our government, right? Like a really important part of government. But Congress really just means a gathering of representatives. So this Continental Congress is the first time that all of the colonies have sent representatives to this meeting to work together. And at first, they really want to find a peaceful solution. They wrote a bunch of letters to British officials hoping that they would convince them that, hey, these laws are unfair, you should get rid of these. Please do what will benefit all of us because we are on the same side, right? Was what a lot of them were saying. But these letters didn't work, as you might have guessed. Here's some random painting of dudes yelling at each other. I don't know. Just kidding. They're all aptly listening. They're like, what does he have to say? This is very interesting. I like the guy in red whispering in the other dude's ear. Pay attention, you're a naughty student. So the First Continental Congress wasn't much of a success, but about a year later, another group, well, mostly it's actually the same people in a lot of cases. Not all of them are the same, but a large chunk of them are the same people. But a year later, representatives meet again. This one we call the Second Continental Congress. Yeah, pretty creative, I know. But at this point, fighting had already started. We'll be talking about that fighting later when we get to chapter 6. But now they realize that things are getting violent fast. They still want to try and talk about peace, but they know that it's going to be difficult. It's going to be hard because there's already been a battle happen in Boston, and potentially more will be happening. Actually, a couple battles in Boston have happened at this point. And so they wrote a letter to the king, which they call the Olive Branch Petition. So an olive branch is historically a sign of peace, right? If you bring an olive branch to a discussion with somebody, it's kind of like basically just saying, hey, we're here to talk peace. We're not here for violence. You wave a branch with olives on it. I don't know where it came from. It's kind of a weird thing, but that's what it is. Different groups have actually done similar things without any connection to each other. They come up with their own ways. So in some places it was an oak branch, and other places had different kinds of plants that you would bring that symbolize that you're ready to talk peace. It's kind of interesting. But anyway, they wrote this letter to King George, basically saying, hey, we still want peace. We're willing to listen and talk, and we want to try and resolve our problems without any more bloodshed. And they wrote this big, beautiful thing to the king. And King George, when it arrived, completely ignored it. He had somebody come in and say, hey, the Americans wrote you this letter. And he said, I won't even read it because they're not my friends right now. Kind of dramatic, kind of being a baby, actually. Anyway, so not only did he not read this, he actually immediately started drafting his own response without having read the letter. He called it the Proclamation of Rebellion. It basically says that the colonies at this point are viewed as traitorous. If anyone were to raise voice or hand or finger even against the British, they are now traitors. And unspoken in that is what the punishment for traitors generally is, which is the death penalty. Anyway, so this basically, not only does it say that the Americans are acting traitorous right now, but also says that all colonial harbors are going to be closed down. Remember, the British have the largest, most powerful navy in the world. The Americans, no navy to speak of. And so the British closing down our harbors, there's not a lot we can do about it at this point. This basically stops all trade, not only between the colonies and the British, but the colonies and everybody at this point. And during the same time, a man, actually an Englishman by the name of Thomas Paine, who had recently moved to the Americas, wrote a pamphlet. He called it Common Sense. Basically, this is his way to try and convince people to join the revolution. He says a lot of stuff in it. It's actually a really good read. It's really not too long. It's a little complicated, but not too much. His goal was to talk to the average person. So a lot of the people who are writing things in the newspapers and whatnot during this time used really complicated speech. They compared things to stories from Greece or Rome or more stories that you had to be a little bit more educated to understand. And Thomas Paine, even though he wasn't even an American, interesting, he kind of studied his audience a little bit better and realized that the average person in the Americas doesn't really know much about Cicero or any of those guys, but they do know quite a bit about Moses. They know quite a bit about King David. They know quite a bit about biblical characters. And so Thomas, instead of using references to Greece and Rome and other things that you'd have to be educated to understand, he instead uses references to the Bible. He uses references to the freedoms that Americans had enjoyed at this point. Not as many as we do now, but he references a lot of things that you would expect the people who'd been in the Americas their whole lives maybe to make those connections. But he had just been here a few years and made those connections, which is pretty cool. But he writes a lot in this, which really helps a lot of people who before, it seemed like the revolution might be more of a philosophical thing and not really something that speaks to the common person. Common sense really speaks to the average person and says, hey, this is why we should fight back. This is why a king doesn't make sense. And so he does literally use common sense throughout this book to explain okay, having a king really doesn't make any sense because why is the prince any better than you? So because he was born to a king, he's a better leader than you? It doesn't make sense. It's not like leadership is going to be necessarily passed down from generation to generation. It's not like wisdom can necessarily be passed down from generation to generation. So making it so that the next king just happened to be born in that family really doesn't make sense, when leadership and the ability to make wise decisions for a group of people, that's something that can be really learned more than just born into. It can be something that you are born with without any connection to it in a prior generation, right? And so we want to be able to vote in people who have earned the right or have demonstrated that ability, rather than just being born into a certain family, right? So that's one of the arguments he makes, but he makes several others in this book. And they actually sold 500,000 copies in just 6 months, which actually made it the second most popular book in the Americas, second only to the Bible, which is pretty good, big accomplishment for Thomas there. And speaking of Thomas, we have another group that now are basically talking about independence within the Second Continental Congress. As they're drafting the Olive Branch petition, the Congress says, okay, some of you work on this Olive Branch petition, but just in case that doesn't work, we're going to also start working on a Declaration of Independence. And pretty quickly, they realize that the Olive Branch petition is not working. And so the Declaration becomes the kind of the big priority from there. They basically wanted to write a letter that would be published to the whole world. This letter would say, this is why we're rebelling. This is what the king has done. This is what the British government has done that makes us feel like we have to do something else. We have to become independent for these reasons. And a lot of times we view this as like, kind of like us just telling the king what we're doing, but that was actually just a secondary benefit, right? The king would get to see why we're mad, but it's really so that the other countries around know why we're doing this, and we're really trying to get some of them to help us, or at least not to help the British against us. So they appointed a group of people to do this. Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin. Ben Franklin was actually supposed to be the leader of this. John Adams, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston. Thomas and John were actually both pretty young, inexperienced in a lot of ways. Remember, we talked about John defending the soldiers with the Boston Massacre, but so he'd had a little bit more exposure to some of the political world. But Thomas Jefferson is just a kid at this point. I think he's 24, 26, something like that. Pretty young, doesn't have much experience in government, but they know he's a fantastic writer. But more importantly, they know he's a Virginian. He's a well-educated Virginian. And we'll talk about why this is important a little bit later. But this is the committee here. Thomas is there on the left. Ben straight in the back, as you can tell, standing up. John Adams on the right. The other two guys didn't help quite as much, so we don't talk about them as often. So Thomas Jefferson ended up being the main author of the Declaration. His ideas were mostly influenced by a philosopher by the name of John Locke. John Locke had talked about the rights of man and how these rights are natural and inherent and born rights, and not something that a king can grant or take away. And so Jefferson borrowed a lot of these ideas and built upon them in some ways. He combined the philosophies with a few other people, but kind of the framework, the main foundation of these arguments are from John Locke. John Adams and Ben Franklin did also help. Franklin was influential on a couple of the famous phrases. So one thing that Jefferson had originally put in his writing was about life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. And Adams and Franklin convinced him to change that to the pursuit of happiness. And a few other little phrases that they kind of modified here and there. The Declaration that we know today is actually slightly different than the one Thomas wrote himself. There was a lot of editing that happened from John Adams and Ben Franklin, but even after that process was completed, they took it to the Second Continental Congress to get approved, and some further changes happened there. This actually took him quite a bit of time. He was working on it for nearly a month, where some of the people were only involved for a couple of days. But it finally finished on July 4th of 1776, and the Congress unanimously approved it with a few changes. One of the things that Thomas Jefferson, which is interesting because he's a slaveholder, he'd actually put in one of the arguments against the king, he had said that basically the British government, the British people, had forced a slave economic system on the South, and that was an evil that had been forced on the people of the Americas. A lot of the Southern representatives in the Continental Congress were really, really uncomfortable with that phrase. And so they only agreed to approve this declaration if that was removed. So kind of an interesting change to that. Copies were sent to the rulers around the world and even printed in the local newspaper. George Washington he wasn't at the Second Continental Congress. That's one of the big things that people are like, George Washington signed the Declaration. No, he didn't. He wasn't anywhere near this. So he actually read this with his troops in Boston. Anyway, it was one of the things that Jefferson was most proud of being a part of. And he really liked to remember fondly his contribution here. This is actually a picture of the fancy version of this. Interestingly, July 4th was when this was passed, but this version, this picture that you see here, was not actually signed this way until actually August. So they approved it. They sent some to be printed in newspapers, but this pretty version of it was not actually signed until I think it was August 2nd, if I recall. So almost a month later. So basically, there's three big things that happen with the Second Continental Congress, and it happens in this order. The first thing they do is draft the Olive Branch Petition. That, again, was ignored by the king. The king, in response, sends them back something called the Proclamation of Rebellion, basically saying, you guys are traitors. If you speak out against our government, you're a traitor. And in response, not only do they speak out against the government, but they also say, okay, we're creating our own government. We're going to be our own country. And this is why. And that's what the Declaration of Independence states. I'll give you a second to write that stuff down. Sorry, I hope you can't hear my fish tank too much. It's kind of loud to me, but maybe not you. Olive Branch, Proclamation of Rebellion, and Declaration of Independence. Hopefully one of these days soon, I have a video of some celebrities reading the Declaration. I just kind of like it because it's a little more interesting than like me just reading it at you. And some of the words are a little bit difficult, so I find it's easier if somebody else reads it to you instead of you trying to read it yourself. So hopefully I have time sometime soon to have you guys watch that video. So we'll see. Okay, that's actually the end of the presentation for today. If there's any time left, I'm not sure how much time is left, if any. If there's any time left, you guys can work on the homework assignment from that I let you start last time we had class. And hopefully I can see you in person on Monday, but no promises. Awesome. Thanks, guys. Have a great rest of your day.